Okay, so here we go, part 3 of the integument. And what we're looking at now are the protein bundles that you would find inside of the dermis of your skin. Because we've covered the parts of the epidermis now. Now we need to take a look at the dermis. So when you get a close-up look of dermis, it doesn't appear to look like much of anything, but it's really thick layers of protein bundles. And the protein here is not keratin, but collagen. Collagen is very resistant to stretching and is a good filler material. Now, in an image like this, you can't see the individual cells, but when you go to more light microscope shots, get closer to the dermis, right, like this one, then you can see cells scattered in and amongst all these pink bundle areas. And so those are the living cells of the dermis, which are mostly going to be fibroblasts, to grow the pinkish protein fibers that help to fill that internal space. But once you're superficial to the dermis, you're in the epidermis with the stratum basale here at the base, then stratum spinosum. Then, since this one's thin skin, you've got the stratum granulosum making the darker cells right there, and there's almost no noticeable stratum lucidum, so the top here is all going to be stratum corneum. But here's another shot, or there was another shot. Where did it go now? Here we go. Of thin skin, corneum, granulosum, spinosum here until you get to basale, and then look at all the stuff that's going on in the dermis. The dermis is pretty active. There's glands, multiple kinds. There's these protein bundles. There's hair follicles that are going through. Right here is just the hairs absent from the interior of the follicle. And muscle bundles that will be connected here too, smooth muscle sections. So we'll be talking about all those components of the dermis next. So back to this. All right. Connective tissue layer beneath the epidermis ranges from 0.2 millimeters to 4 millimeters. So the dermis can be pretty thick. I mean, 4 millimeters is probably about the width of maybe 2 dimes on top of one another. Okay. Mostly collagen with elastic fibers, reticular fibers, and fibroblasts. Well supplied with blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, which are the same as the oil glands, and nerve endings. Right. So when you take a look at the dermis on a slide, it may look somewhat indistinct. Right? Here, it's not the blue now, but the little purple dots, those are living cells, and the blue stuff are the collagen fibers. Okay? The upper portion of the dermis, though, often forms these big bumps that kind of push into the epidermis. And those things are called dermal papilla. One papilla is a finger-like projection of soft tissue. Right? And so these papilla are poking up into the epidermis and kind of shaping the epidermis a little bit. Which is why, if you have thick skin, then you may see that those dermal papilla are particularly intense and cause friction ridges. Like this one. Right? So they're the dermal papilla, causing the epidermis to kind of go up and down in big bumps. So that when you see it from the very surface, without a microscope, you see that there are parts of your epidermis that are going up and down, and those are your fingerprints. You're only going to find fingerprints on your thick skin areas, so palms and soles. And we call them friction ridges because they increase the total surface area of your epidermis, and so they now allow you to grip better onto things that you're touching with your hands or feet. Right? On the back of your hand, there's no friction ridges, but there may be folds, there may be tiny little lines that you see there, and that is because the rest of your skin will still have shapes and surfaces to it, thanks to the dermal papilla kind of sticking up in some places but not in others. Right? But all of your dermis is going to have dermal papilla, but it's just in the thick skin areas where the dermal papilla are going to go higher and lower and so create the friction ridges. Right? Let's see, what else? Okay. If you're talking about thin skins, in the dermis that you're going to find your hair follicles embedded, and when you're talking about your nails, nail roots are embedded in the dermis as well. Let's see. There are muscles, small bundles of smooth muscle that are going to be also associated with your dermis, and these bundles are called erector pili muscles. A-R-R-E-C-T-O-R, P-I-L-I. Now the P-I-L-I part means having to do with a hair. One hair is called a pilus. But the erector pili, or piloerector muscle, because you can say it both ways, just means it helps to cause your hair to stand erect. So this is the cause of goosebumps. Now, in other animals, there are other muscles that can be found just below the surface of the skin. Like if you've ever seen a horse have a fly land on its hind flank or something like that, and then it just appears like a section of the horse's skin just twitches a little bit, and then the fly is kicked off. That's because they have something called the cutaneous maximus muscle. Cats have it, dogs have it, a number of other animals do. We don't. We can't make any section of our skin twitch voluntarily, but involuntarily we can have our hair stand on it because of the piloerector muscles. Let's see. So these smooth muscle bundles connect to the hair roots. Skeletal muscles may attach to the fibers of the dermis if you're, say, talking about a place like your face, where you're making facial expressions. So when you waggle your eyebrows up and down, right, that's because you're using skeletal muscle attached deeply to the bones of your skull to move the skin around on your head. Right? If you have particularly good control, you can wiggle your ears or make your scalp move back and forth. I can't do that without actually holding onto it. But any of those little facial tricks that you can do are because of skeletal muscles attaching to the dermal fibers of your skin. Right? Alright, so we covered dermal papilla, and that top fifth of the entire dermis that contain the papilla and the most superficial blood vessels we call the papillary layer of the dermis. Then when you get to the bottom 4/5, we call that the reticular layer, because it's dominated, well, it's dominated by dense irregular fibrous connective tissue, but that's where you're going to find more reticular fibers as opposed to the papillary layer, which has a few more areolar fibers. Okay. Let's see. Papilla. Yeah, so papillary layer, thin zone in and near the dermal papilla, loosely organized, allows mobility of leukocytes, and is rich in small blood vessels. So anytime that you get a cut and your skin bleeds, that means you had to go through all of the epidermis in order to get down to these blood vessels in the papillary layer of your dermis. Right? And so most things, most small cuts are probably not going to go that far, simple scrapes and lacerations. But if you do have a deeper cut, it can go all the way down to the hypodermis, where there'd be bigger blood vessels and so more blood loss from that area. That would probably mean that you'd end up with a scar rather than just having the skin heal over the wound. Okay. The reticular layer is deeper, thicker, consists of dense, irregular connective tissue with thicker collagen bundles, and tearing of the collagen from stretching can produce stria or stretch marks. Sometimes your tissue below the skin can grow quickly, like, say, weight gain, or adding muscle mass, or pregnancy, in which case the skin above it has all of its protein fibers pulled away from one another, and in some cases those protein fibers can shear. In which case you now have an area where there's fewer whitish protein fibers of collagen, and so the blood from below and here can now be seen through the skin more easily, and so it appears to be a darker red line with kind of some irregular edges to it, and that's what a stretch mark is, just because it happened in multiple areas in the skin above the tissue that was growing. Okay. So if that growth goes away, baby is born, or there's loss of muscle mass or loss of adipose tissue, then the protein fibers can come closer to one another, but they're still going to be a little bit thinner in that region. So stretch marks almost never completely fade, but you can encourage them to fade somewhat by encouraging the repair of the collagenous tissue in the papillary and reticular layers of the dermis. Okay, and then hypodermis, or I talked about that. Hypodermis is subcutaneous fat tissue, more areolar and adipose than dermis, and helps to give some padding to the body. And I mentioned the hypodermic needle can be injected here in order to get it to these blood vessels. That subcutaneous fat is an energy reservoir, and it's one of the reasons that we have fat, period, any place, is to be a place to store lipids, but also provides us some thermal insulation, and is 8% thicker in women, which is an interesting gender difference, but the reason for the increased levels of adipose tissue under female skin appears to have to do with the potential for reproduction. Because if you're going to grow a whole new human being, then you need more resources to have on you, just in case you may not be able to get meals. Now, I mean, this is thinking way back to our ancestors 20,000, 200,000 years ago. They needed to store their fuels because not every meal was going to be coming at a regular time. So the storing of extra subcutaneous fat in females was an adaptation that increased the likelihood of successful pregnancy and reproduction. And this also seems to have led to the further development of what we consider to be the female physique. There's more adipose tissue underneath the skin, which covers over muscular edges and tends to make women more curvy. Hips, thighs, buttocks, and so forth, and it may be a little bit harder to get definition because of that increased deposition of adipose tissue underneath the skin. Right? But this doesn't mean that a woman who has good muscle definition can't have a child, because, I mean, it's the nutrition that's going into the person that's really going to determine whether that person can bear a child successfully or not. So you don't have to have thick adipose tissue under the skin to bear a child. You just have to have a sufficient intake of nutrition. But here's one interesting thing about that fat deposition. There's another gender difference. No, not that one. Where's the image I was looking for? I lost it. Oh well. Men also have places where fat gets deposited. Men in particular tend to get their fat deposits around the waist, hips, and buttocks. Women, besides breasts, hips, and buttocks, also have a tendency to deposit extra adipose tissue on the back of the neck and underneath the arm here, which creates what in my family was always called the granny wave. Right? But that's just, again, based on that increased deposition of adipose tissue as part of a reproductive adaptation. Right, so I guess don't not find the image, so I'll just X that one out. No, don't X that. Alright, so, alright. Getting back on the main topic. Right. Skin color. Skin color is produced by pigment molecules, and your skin is not colored entirely by melanin, although melanin is, as it says here, the most significant factor in skin color. Produced by your melanocytes, and then accumulates in the living keratinocytes of the stratum basale and stratum spinosum, and there's two forms. Eumelanin, which is a brownish-black color, and pheomelanin, which is a reddish-yellow color. So you can now make some assessments as to what kind of melanin you might find in people's hair or skin based on the color that's there. So when I have hair, it's reddish. So that means I probably have a greater quantity of pheomelanin in it rather than eumelanin. If a person has a darker, more auburn hair, then they may have a combination of pheomelanin and increased quantities of eumelanin. And then as you go towards the brunettes, then you would see probably more eumelanin and maybe less pheomelanin until you have solid black, which is pretty much all eumelanin, no pheomelanin. And a blonde person might have relatively little of both. And so it's closer to being pigmentless. Right? But it's not just hair, it's skin as well. Skin can also have different casts and colors based on the quantity of melanin present. But that's not the only pigment. Other pigments that are going to change your skin color are the hemoglobin that's in your blood. So skin can become more red or paler depending on how much blood is present. And there's also one that's called carotene. C-A-R-O-T-E-N-E. And carotene is a yellowish pigment that typically only accumulates in areas where there's thick stratum corneum. So that means it appears more in the dead cells rather than the living cells, making it seem a little bit more yellowish. So if you have calluses on your hands or anyplace else, then take a look at that skin and you'll see that it does have more of a yellowish cast to it because of the carotene pigment present as opposed to melanin, which is in the living sections of your skin. Okay? So, this is something I mentioned before. People with different skin colors have the same number of melanocytes, but dark-skinned people have more melanin coming out of those cells. The melanin granules and keratinocytes are more spread out than tightly clumped, and the melanin breaks down more slowly. Whereas in a lighter-skinned individual, that melanin is going to degrade more rapidly. Okay. All right, so let's see. Light-skinned people, melanin clump near keratinocyte nucleus, melanin breaks down more rapidly, little seen beyond the stratum basale. The amount of melanin also varies with exposure to ultraviolet rays of sunlight. So this is why people tan. Right? When a person develops a tan, it is a reaction. Right? You don't tan first and then go out into the sun. It's the other way around. You have to be exposed to an increased dosage of ultraviolet radiation, which may have actually done you some harm. And so your body responds to that stimulus by growing more melanin out of the melanocytes that you've already got. And so it spreads further throughout the skin at a greater concentration, and thus you gain a darker coloration. I listened to a really interesting talk which was examining the evolutionary biology of humanity. And what it talked about was this. We know that humanity came from a Middle Eastern region of the planet. So Mesopotamia and what we now call the Middle East. So Iraq, Iran, the northeastern components of Africa, that area right there is where we think Homo sapiens arose from. And so that region is equatorial, with a lot of sunlight. And we're pretty certain that as human beings became less hairy, we also developed more pigment. And so that the original humans were those who had a darker cast to them. And then humanity spread from the Middle East out to the rest of the continents. And during that 100,000 years of developmental time, mutations appeared. One of those mutations was for white-skinned individuals. Right? So the first form was a dark-skinned individual that could resist the high quantity of sunlight that would be coming in the equatorial areas. And so when this white mutation showed up, it probably wasn't going to work terribly well in equatorial areas, because those people would get sunburned and have damage, and that would probably reduce their lifespan and maybe their reproductive success. But as humanity spread into more northern and southern climes, then you found areas that were more overcast during the course of the entire year. And now the mutation becomes an adaptation. Because if there's not a lot of sunlight, then in order for you to make a sufficient quantity of vitamin D every day, then you need to let more sunlight go through your skin to get to the blood. So we think now that the white-skinned appearance of some humans, in particularly northern climes where there's a lot more overcast skies, became an adaptation that made them more successful, because they could get vitamin D. Whereas a darker-skinned individual in those northern climes, well, their skin would inhibit the passage of ultraviolet radiation, and so they wouldn't be able to make as much vitamin D. And so now we start seeing a differential on the planet as to where light-skinned individuals and dark-skinned individuals would appear, because in the more sunny areas, you need a darker skin to inhibit some of that high-intensity UV radiation, but they will not stop all of it, and so that person can make vitamin D. But you go to a more overcast environment, and now the lighter skin individual is favored because the lighter skin allows ultraviolet radiation to get in, they can make vitamin D, but the darker skinned individual would stop too much of it, and so vitamin D production would be inhibited. And that may be one of the reasons why we end up with people like, Scottish people, Irish people, British people, Norwegians, Scandinavians, all being kind of pale and blonde or redheaded and so forth, because those environments favored a lighter skin color. Because those lighter skin colors allowed UV radiation, sufficient UV radiation to be absorbed, and they could make vitamin D. So it was a particularly interesting piece of research with a lot of good evidence to back it up. Getting off topic again. All right, so back into skin color. Three things are going to color your skin: melanin from your melanocytes, and they'll be in the living layers of your epidermis, so stratum basale, stratum spinosum, and to a certain degree stratum granulosum. Hemoglobin, which is from your red blood cells, so that's only going to be where you find blood. Blood is only going to be in the dermis portions, not the epidermis portions. And then carotene, yellow pigment acquired from egg yolks and yellow-orange vegetables, but it concentrates in the stratum corneum, in the dead layers of cells. And so the best place to see the carotene pigment is in calluses of your skin. Alright, now, here's a little bit more on skin color that doesn't have to do quite so much with a healthy individual, but things that may be not necessarily unhealthy, but just not the norm. Okay? So, colors of diagnostic value. If you see these colors on a person's skin, it tells you something about their state of health. Right? Anything that's cyan is blue. So this is kind of a cyan color. Right? And if the skin has cyanosis, you've got blueness of the skin from deficiency of oxygen in the circulating blood. So a kid who holds his breath until he turns blue, well, the skin is now going cyanotic as a result. Right? A person who is having difficulty breathing, drowning, choking, that can lead to cyanosis. Lung diseases like emphysema, respiratory arrest, cold weather, or cardiac arrest, all of those things can reduce the amount of oxygen in the circulating blood. The reason the cold weather would do it, or say being in the water until your lips turn blue, is because cold temperatures tend to reduce the size of your lung vessels, so less oxygen is getting into your lungs with every breath. Right? So, blue skin, cyanosis, reduction of oxygen in your blood. Erythema, on the other hand, abnormal redness of the skin due to dilated cutaneous vessels. So in other words, your skin has flushed red. The ery part, E-R-Y, that's like an erythrocyte, a red blood cell. So when one exercises, typically the skin is going to flush red. Hot weather, sunburn, anger, or embarrassment, so it doesn't have to be from an actual injury or physiological response, it can be an emotional one. Blood vessels are going to dilate in the region, and so the area becomes red. Now, why would skin become super red if you're sunburned? Well, you've absorbed a lot of ultraviolet radiation, and it's harmed some of your living cells, which means that they need to repair. If you need to repair tissue, what do you need to send more of to that tissue? Blood. And so as a result, your damaged skin tissue is now going to become erythemic, going to become reddened, and because it's been damaged, it's also going to inflame slightly. It'll probably become more sensitive to touch and temperature and consequently pain. So that's one of the reasons that your sunburn hurts. Your skin has become inflamed because of the damage that has already been done, and it feels hot because of the blood that's rushing to it. Not because you're absorbing any heat from outside, you're now releasing more heat from the inside because there's more blood running to the area. If you know somebody who has a bad sunburn or have one of your own, then you can put your hand over the sunburn and feel the heat coming off of that area. It's not because you absorb sun heat and now just bleeding it off, it's heat that's coming from within you, thanks to the enlarged blood vessels. If a person has pallor, pale or ashen color, where there's so little blood flow through the skin that the white color of the dermal collagen is visible, this means that a person is going pale. So if a person has an emotional shock, suddenly the color may drain from their face, as is written in many bits of literature. That's pallor. Right? Emotional stress, low blood pressure, or circulatory shock, cold, or anemia could cause that to happen. But this brings up an interesting point about cold temperature. I was shoveling snow earlier today, and when I came back in, my face was bright red. Right? I hadn't gone pale. This is because your body has to go through two forms of adjustment when it comes to cold temperatures. If you just are suddenly exposed to a momentary cold temperature, then your body's going to try to regulate and keep all temperatures stable. So if my skin gets cold, then the first thing it does is try to send more blood there. So my ears become red, my face becomes red because it's cold. But if my body starts losing extra heat to the environment, then it needs to try to conserve that heat so I don't become too hypothermic. So the best way, one of the ways to reduce that heat loss to the environment is to constrict the blood vessels. And now the skin goes pale. So if you just, open up the freezer and you're hit with a blast of cold air, you're not going to take on pallor. You may take on a little bit of erythema as your face gets a little bit redder to try and bring temperatures back to a normal level. But then if you climb into the freezer and stay there for some period of time, then you're going to go through pallor first, as the blood vessels are going to constrict, and so your skin becomes paler as you try to keep the heat closer to your core. And then if you keep staying in that cold environment, then the quantity of oxygen that you're going to get into your lungs is going to be reduced further, and now your blood is going to become low oxygen, and your skin can now take on cyanosis. So initial cold exposure, redness or erythema. Continued cold exposure, pallor. Further cold exposure, cyanosis. Until finally, if your tissue is so deprived of blood that that the tissue actually dies, then you may now be going into necrosis, the death of the tissue. So it goes from blue to becoming black, and that's what happens to a person who is suffering from frostbite. Right? But getting back to the other colors, albinism. An albino is a person who has no pigments. They're incapable of making melanin. So genetic lack of melanin that results in white hair, pale skin, and pink eyes. So the iris of the eye is colored in its various forms, brown and blue and black and all the stranger ones in between, like the violets and the greens and so forth, based on the quantity of melanin that's present. And so albinism can't make any of those pigments. Right? And usually albinism is an inherited recessive non-functional tyronase allele. So tyrosinase is an enzyme that breaks up tyrosine that is necessary in order to make melanin pigment. Okay. Let's see what's left. Jaundice and hematoma. Okay. Jaundice is yellow skin. Yellowing of skin and sclera, which are the whites of your eyes, due to excess of bilirubin in blood. Bilirubin is a pigment that comes from the breakdown of hemoglobin that's in your red blood cells, and that's normally done by your liver. So if your liver is dysfunctional, then that's when a person might have jaundice. Premature born babies may also have a high incidence of jaundice because their liver is not fully functional yet. Before they were in the womb, and the mother was taking care of getting rid of some of those waste materials from the child's hemoglobin breakdown. And the kid's liver was not doing the job. Though, if the premature child is born, then may have jaundice because its liver is not functional yet. So, also in adults, cancer of the liver, hepatitis, inflammation of the liver, cirrhosis of the liver, other compromised liver function that can lead to the jaundice. Then here we go. A hematoma is a bruise, a massive clotted blood that shows through the skin. It basically means you had to take some sort of impact that crushed blood vessels underneath the epidermis and in the dermis, and now they're bleeding into that space. They're bleeding into this area of the dermis, and so you can now see that extra blood through the surface. It starts off being purplish because the blood that's coming out is deoxygenated. So it's bluish purplish blood, which is then has its color changed somewhat as it's being shown through the white components of your skin, or well, whatever other pigments you may have in the skin to change that color. Then after time, as the hemoglobin is broken down in the bruise, then it can go through those other strange colors like kind of greenish yellow and until it finally fades. Okay? But still, any hematoma is a bruise, massive clotted blood showing through the skin. Alright, I already talked about evolution of skin color, so leave that alone. Alright, skin markings. Yeah, so just a little bit more on skin markings and then I'll finish this one off. Okay. We're talking about friction ridges, your fingerprints. Markings on the fingertips that leave oily fingerprints on surfaces we touch. The ability to take fingerprints and identify people by them, that's only been around for a couple of hundred years. The first technology that allowed us to take fingerprints appeared in the 1800s. Right? So that was not the adaptation that fingerprints provided. They provide increased friction with contact on structures, so they're grippies. Okay? Everyone does have a unique pattern formed during field development that remains unchanged throughout life, and not even identical twins have identical fingerprints. Partially because the fingerprints have a genetic base, but also an environmental basis. Just how did your dermal papilla grow underneath the surface of your skin, and thus you have your individual fingerprints, and allows manipulation of small objects. So if you didn't have those little grippies there, it'd be pretty difficult to, say, even pick up a pin or a small sequin or whatever it is that you're trying to pick up without that extra surface area on your fingertips. Now when you flip over to take a look at the other side of your hand or any other part of the body, you'll have flexion lines. Lines on the flexor surfaces of the digits, palms, wrists, and elbows. Right? So all those little folds that you see, they just mark the areas where the skin had to fold up a little bit more because of the way that your joints are organized. So yeah, there are flexor lines here on the palm side, and those are the lines that a palm reader would read, your flexion lines. But even on the back, you're also going to see almost like a diamond pattern, and that also are the flexion creases as your skin has to change its position over your knuckles and your wrist. Okay? Freckles and moles. Tan to black aggregations of melanocytes. Like I said, they're clustered rather than being spread out more evenly. Freckles are flat melanized patches, but a mole is an elevated melanized patch, often with hair in it. And if you do have a raised mole, then it's worth keeping an eye on. Mole should be watched for changes in color, diameter, or contour, and may suggest malignancy. So I've been asked about this before. If you have a mole, or maybe you start off with a freckle, but then suddenly that freckle becomes raised, then that's something that you be aware of and watch. And then if the mole becomes really dark, I mean like a blackish color, and if the edges are irregular, so instead of being a sort of nice smooth oval shape, have jagged lines making up their edges, then that would indicate that there may be rapid growth occurring from that spot, and you may have a melanoma, one of the most common types of cancers out there. And think about that. Why should a melanoma be one of the most common types of cancer? Well, your skin is exposed to the environment all the time, and that environmental exposure means that that's where you're going to get the accumulated damage that comes from UV radiation or any other environmental influences that could cause these cells to start growing at an unnatural rate. But if you do have a skin cancer, this is also one of the easiest ones to fix, because you catch it early and they can just kind of scoop it right out. You don't want to let something like that go too long, though, because the cells could start to grow downwards as opposed to being on the surface. And if they grow downwards, then they'll eventually encounter things like your blood vessels and also another set of vessels called lymphatic vessels, in which case these cancer cells could break off the main mass, go into one of those transport tube systems, and now a cancer cell could flow through the blood or the lymphatic system to anywhere else in the body and set up shop. And now you have a second tumor, whereas before you had just one. This is what's called metastasis. When a tumor metastasizes, you started with one, but some of the cells grew downwards, got into some of your transport systems, and then created more cancers elsewhere in the body. And this is why prevention is a matter of being aware. If you see something that looks like it's growing, then have it observed, and have it looked at, and then get rid of it as quickly as you possibly can. All right. And one more thing. Hemangiomas, or birthmarks, are patches of discolored skin caused by benign tumors of dermal blood capillaries. So what this would be something that looks particularly red underneath the surface of the skin. Some disappear in childhoods, others last for life. Capillary hemangiomas, cavernous hemangiomas, or port wine stain, which you might see on, say, the noses of people who are alcoholic, that redness, those strawberry marks, are hemangiomas. Okay? But not all birthmarks are going to be because of these blood vessel growths. Sometimes birthmarks are just going to be thicker clusters of melanocytes underneath the surface of the skin. So just a particularly large freckle. I have one on my leg. All right, but there we go. That should be enough for this one, and I'll leave hair and nails for the lecture that I think we should be having on Wednesday. So I'll get these things posted, and I'll see you on Wednesday if I don't see people on Tuesday. All right, stay safe.